Good evening, everyone,
Good evening.
and welcome to the Enoch Pratt Free Library Writers Live program. I am Vivian Fisher, Deputy Chief for Public Services here at the central location. This evening, we are pleased to have our guest author, Tamara Lanier, in conversation with Lisa Snowden McCrae. Before I begin my introductions, I would like to remind you that we have many outstanding forthcoming programs at the Pratt, including our Book Lovers Breakfast event with scholar Imani Perry this upcoming Saturday. So if you miss it this year, think about it for next year. So please pick up your copy of the Compass newsletter or go to our website, prattlibrary.org, for future programs. Tamara K. Lanier is a tireless champion for truth and justice and a plaintiff advocacy. She is a board member of Connecticut's Racial Profiling Prohibition Project, the past vice president of the New London NAACP, and an active member of the St. John's Christian Church of Groton, Connecticut. Lanier has several passions, one of which is to eradicate racial and ethnic disparities in Connecticut's criminal justice system and to put an end to the ugly practice of racial profiling. She has been a constant voice for change and has traveled the country promoting the need for a national dialogue relative to slavery and its impact on society. She lives in Norwich, Connecticut, and this evening she will discuss her latest work, From These Roots. Our moderator, Lisa Snowden McCrae, is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Baltimore Beat. She is a former editor at the Baltimore Sun, the Baltimore City Paper, and the Real News Network. Her writings have appeared in numerous publications, including Essence, the Washington Post, and the Baltimore Magazine. Please join me in welcoming Tamara Lanier and Lisa Snowden McCrae to the Pratt Library.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I know that we are in very unstable times, and I think one of the best things that we can do, the antidote, is getting in front of each other and honoring stories like the one we're going to hear tonight. So I really appreciate you all coming out, and I appreciate you coming to join us tonight in Baltimore. and happy publication day. So we'll start with a little visual aid, and then we'll go into some conversation, and then you guys can ask some questions.
Okay, so this is a PowerPoint that was created for when I give these types of presentations. And actually, my daughter did the graphics, and so I want to give a shout out to my daughter, Tamara Lanier, who is a phenomenal graphics. And so the reason why I created this was because there's so many events that I talk about in the book where I also have a visual, a graphic picture that helps tell the story and helps to take you to that place where I was and for you to experience what I saw. So I wanted to share this with you so that you can come along the journey with me. And so, how do we make it? This is my family genealogy tree, and I'm not sure how many have read the book or are familiar with the story about my enslaved ancestor Renty, but this picture demonstrates that there are 5 generations of men named after Papa Renty, the man in the image, the man in the daguerreotype. And I like to share and show that for 2 reasons. Firstly, visual to see, because genealogy, when you talk about it, it's confusing and complicated, but when you look at it and see the straight line, it makes it easier to follow and understand, but also to demonstrate how much this man meant to his children. 5 generations of direct descendants named after Papa Renty in my family, and I know that other children, Papa Renty's other children also named their children after him. That's how much this man meant to his children. Next. This is my mother. Again, my daughter with the graphic arts. She imposed pictures of me, Papa Renty, and my mother. This is my mom when she was much younger. But my mom grew up in the household with her ancestors or her elders, and my mom grew up in a household with enslaved elders. My mom's grandfather, who was also named Renty, was born a slave, lived many years as a slave, and shared these stories with her. She was the daughter of sharecropper parents. She was an educator. She was also, I refer to her as the keeper of our family story. She was the little child who sat and listened attentively when the elders were talking about the old days and the old times and who Papa Renty was. And she internalized those stories. She kept those stories and she shared them with her children. She shared them with my children. And now I, who have a new grandson, I have introduced him to Papa Renty, to my mother, so that I have told him, even though he's 8 months old now, that it is now his responsibility to be the keeper of our family story. Next slide. I included this because, and when you read the book, the one thing that I hope stands out is the miraculous encounters I have with people who, I like to say that I am the benefit of so much grace and goodwill. I did not know how to do any genealogical work, and this is 2010, when the internet wasn't then what it is today. And my mother, who, like I said earlier, she remembered these stories. She passed on these stories to us. And when she became sick, she started telling me, I want you to write these things down. I want you to create a family tree. And I want you to document the history of our family, starting with Papa Renty. And I'm like, okay. And I just encouraged her because at this point she's ill, and she knows she's approaching the end of her life, and this was so very important to her. So as she got older and her health started to fail, she would insist, I want you to write this down, write this down, write this down. When she passed, I I was burdened by the promise that I had made to her to write these stories down. I felt obligated. I knew that I had to do this, but I was clueless as to what to do. And I happened to be out walking on a lunch break one afternoon, and I stopped into this gentleman's ice cream shop where he also had salads. And I purchased lunch, and I shared with him that my mom had passed, and I was burdened by this promise that I had made to her to write our family, document our family legacy and our oral history, and do the genealogical work, and I didn't know how to do it. And he said, I'd love to do this stuff. He says, write down what you know, and I'll take a shot at it. And I remember thinking when he said that, because again, 2010, and with the internet and social media and senior citizens, I remember jokes back then that they didn't know where to find the power button. So I remember thinking, okay, what is Rich going to be able to find? And I wrote down what I knew, and I shared it with him, and I paid for my salad, and I left the store. And lo and behold, I don't go back to the store for several weeks, but when I do, he threw his hands up in the air and he says, where have you been? I found your Papa Renty on the internet. What is my Papa Renty doing on the internet? What are you talking about? But that is the man who started me on my journey. I never would have been able in that moment to do the research to find this information. He was an ice cream shop owner, and I talk about him in my book as, you know, this internet super sleuth. Like, he was really, really a great researcher. He found amazing information. He put the information together in an amazing, powerful document for me and started me on my journey. And I credit him. And when I talk about my journey, I have to start with this man and the help that he did to get me started. I like to include this book. There's one thing that I talk about throughout the book, but I am a good receipt keeper. And so not only just in terms of just everyday life, but also in terms of like my kids' work. When they had school projects or worked on things, I kept them. And my daughter, who wrote a book about Papa Renty, her first book report was about Papa Renty, long before Harvard knew about Papa Renty, long before we did. And she was in 4th grade, and she dedicated her book to her younger sister, my youngest daughter, so that she could know where she came from. And I include this just to say, we were talking about Papa Renty and celebrating who he was long before the daguerreotypes was a thing. And it isn't like I suddenly discovered them and started talking about them. I can go back and show that this was a part of who we were growing up, and a part of who my children were growing up all along. And it isn't just because I recently, or in 2010, I discovered the daguerreotypes. We were talking about them long before. And again, my daughter with her graphics, my mom always remembered, and she imported an image of Renty and Delia. She put them together in the backdrop of the African continent. Next. This is kind of like one of my favorite chapters in the book because it was just so mind-boggling. So much happened. But during the research, one of the things that I realized is that in order to find my enslaved ancestors and where they landed or where they ended up, I had to find the descendants of the enslaver and where his children landed and ended up. So I had to learn about the Taylor family who enslaved my family. And I had to find them in order to find my ancestors. And I was blessed with an opportunity. I connected with a woman on the internet on a social media group who knew the history of Columbia, South Carolina. She was able to connect me to this man, the man here in the video, Dr. Edmund Taylor, who is the great-great-grandson of the man who enslaved our family. And Rose, who is right here with the black shirt on. The picture's small, but she was amazing, and she's a big part of my story. But she found him, she gave me his telephone number, and I called him up one Sunday afternoon, and I said, you know, hey, you don't know me, but I'm working on a genealogy project, and I'm trying to find descendants of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, in order to find my family who was enslaved by him. And he was at the time 98 years old and hard of hearing. I talked to him through his daughter, and ultimately he invited me to come and spend the weekend with him. And so I hung up the phone and I go out my bedroom to my daughters and said, you know, we're going to Columbia, South Carolina to spend the weekend with the man whose family enslaved our family. And I mean, the expression on my girls' face was priceless. Mom, we're not going, Mom, you're not going. And you know, it was a while before, and they know me, and they know once I have, you know, my mind is set, there's no changing it. And you know, they were concerned because I'd never met this person, didn't know anything about him, but I was going to spend the weekend with him. And I can honestly say that that is an experience that I will take with me to my grave. Dr. Taylor was amazing. He was 98 years old. He is now passed on. But he reminded me of my mother. He was the keeper of their family story and their family history. He knew all about the Taylor family. We went on tours of South Carolina. You know, one of the things that I like to say about him, and I wish he had lived to be a part of this discussion, because he wasn't afraid to speak about, you know, being a descendant of people who enslaved people. He said to me several times that the Taylors were good slaveholders who treated their enslaved with dignity and respect. And I am, you know, as respectful as I can be, because it wasn't lost on me that the reason I needed to see him is because he had information that I needed. But I felt that, you know, he very strongly wanted me to know that the Taylors were good people, and he went out of his way to do that. One of the things that he talked about was that he introduced me to people that he had put through school. We went on tours where he showed where the Taylors had given back so much land to the state of South Carolina. So I felt like he was showing me what they had done to atone for their sins, so to speak. The other thing about the visit with him, I write about this in the book, that I felt like I was hearing two perspectives of the same thing. The stories that he told about the Taylor enslavers was the same story that my mom told from Renty's perspective. So I was hearing things from Renty's perspective and the slaveholders' perspective, the same stories. My mom talked about Renty's children stealing away and escaping to Ohio on the Underground Railroad. Dr. Taylor said his family operated an Underground Railroad and sent many of the slaves off to Ohio on the Underground Railroad. He talked about, one of the things that, he talked about this woman who he referred to as Mama Letty. And Mama Letty was someone who cared for him, but what I took away from that conversation was he was embracing some of the same traditions that my enslaved ancestors did. We called our women in the family Mama Turi, Mama Ophelia, there's a number of, the women were mamas, and the men were Papa, like Papa Renty. And so when he was referring to the enslaved women that were in the Taylor household, he was calling them Mama too. And so I just felt like he didn't realize it, but he was embracing African culture. And this picture here, I share this because when we visited the slave burial grounds where my ancestors are buried, it was an experience, a surreal experience that I'll never forget. And the person who escorted us and was someone like a guide who was telling us the history of the cemetery, he pointed to these yucca plants and he said, you know, that these plants were used as markers to mark the place where enslaved people buried their loved ones. And I got the chills when I looked across and saw the sea of yucca plants. And I remembered lamenting, feeling like these people toiled their entire life. they were enslaved their entire life. They built the South. Their lives weren't recorded at birth. They weren't recorded at death, and then when they died, they were thrown away as if they never existed. And it was just an emotional experience, because when you see the wave of yucca plants, you see just despair, and you feel despair, and you just see the disrespect for Black life. And so, you know, like I said, that trip is something I will take with me to my grave. I learned a lot from Dr. Taylor, and there was so much in terms of what I saw and what I experienced that helped me not only into framing and writing the book, but just my understanding of the disenfranchisement of Black life.
And is that the cupboard that your ancestors created?
Now, yes, that's another thing. So I had the slave index from Benjamin Franklin Taylor, the slaveholder. And one thing that I knew is that my ancestor was the family carpenter. And so we sat at the table with Dr. Taylor when he narrates this story. He talks here in this video. But the one thing he said is that you're eating from the dishes of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, and you're sitting at the table and chair that was hand-carved by the family carpenter. And in that moment, you could have knocked me off the chair with a feather, because I knew that my enslaved ancestor was identified as the carpenter. So I was just stuck in that moment, because I remember looking at the detail of the woodwork and just how amazingly, you know, we're talking 200 years later. I'm sitting in a chair that's handcrafted by my ancestor that has this amazing woodwork and character, and I was just in awe. And so I later said, Dr. Taylor, my ancestor is identified as the carpenter in your family will. Can I take a picture of these things? And he allowed me to do that, the table, the chairs. And I just, again, and strangely enough, my mother's brother was also a carpenter. Carpentry was in our family, and it was just a surreal moment for me, because I remember just being lost in that moment and not even able to hear him, just looking in amazement at the mastercy of the carpentry work of my ancestor. I included this is a copy of the Blueback Speller. My mom talked about Renty's literacy. Renty was an educator. He learned to read and taught himself to read with Noah Webster's Blueback Speller. I lived not too far from the Noah Webster house in Hartford, Connecticut. I went there one day and picked up a copy. And I included this because I want people to see, I want you to, if you have an opportunity, take a look at the Blueback Speller. And this is something my mom would often say about Renty. If you don't know how to read, it's not easy to teach yourself. And I just want people to understand the amazing feat that enslaved people did to learn to read and teach themselves to read. And what they used to do, and I know I could not teach myself to read with this book. And so those enslaved people who taught themselves to read were extraordinary, and I just wanted to share that. And I encourage people to get a hold of that and take a look at that book and see what they used. They didn't have teachers, there weren't instructors in classrooms. They stole away when they could, and they used this book. And you know, it's phonetically arranged, but I can tell you, I've looked at it from start to finish. I could have taught myself to read it.
And after Papa Renty taught himself, he taught other people.
And taught other people. So our ancestors were doing amazing things. And the other thing that I, through traveling the South and the research, you know, when I was coming up as a child, I was taught that enslaved people couldn't read because they weren't allowed to read. But my reality and my family, and I'm sure many others, they couldn't say they could read. They couldn't announce that, but there were more literate slaves than we're aware of and that we were taught. So they did teach themselves to read, and I just encourage you to take a look at the book that they used to do that, and you'll have more respect for the literacy of slaves. I included this picture because, again, when I talk about the benefit of so much goodwill and grace, when I realized, and you know, the daguerreotypes, and I discover Renty's images at Harvard's Peabody Museum. Harvard is hosting seminars and workshops and had publishing books about who these enslaved people were. And when they would do this, they would celebrate Louis Agassiz and marginalize my ancestors. And so I reached out, and you gotta correct that. You know, Renty was an educator. He was literate. He was an amazing person. But when Harvard would tell the story, they would say he was invisible. And, you know, they would, again, marginalize him and celebrate this person who used these enslaved people to create a race science to prove black inferiority. And so when I reached out to Harvard, I'm like, you gotta correct this narrative. This isn't who my enslaved people were. But they had already decided what the narrative was going to be, and they didn't want to hear my story, and they just wanted me to go away. And every time, you know, I would approach them, every time I would see something they've published or they've written, please correct that. Please, you know, talk about the true man that Renty was. They weren't interested. And so ultimately, I figured out that, you know, during the research, I learned that Harvard, again, publishing books, doing all of this work to tell my story, and it wasn't the true story. And so I happened to be at a conference where Ben Crump was speaking. He was speaking in New York at Al Sharpton's annual conference, and I went. And I was not in that, you know, I didn't go to speak to Ben Crump. I went because of the criminal justice component of the conference. That was my interest at the time, but I heard Ben Crump speak. And I'm thinking about my battles with Harvard and thinking he's one who would not be afraid to challenge Harvard or to confront Harvard because, again, Harvard, with their money and their influence, people capitulate to him and they don't stand up to him. And so when Ben was speaking, I said, I have to reach out to him and share my story. But we were in a crowded auditorium, I don't know, hundreds of people were there. And I was in the back of the room, and I started making my way to the stage where he was, and everybody was taking pictures with him. And I'm pressing my way through, and I make it to him, and I had a picture of Papa Renty, and I showed it to him. I said, this is my enslaved ancestor. And I told him that his likeness and his legacy is being appropriated by Harvard University. And I believe that this is a reparations case. And we exchanged business cards. It was very, very pleasant. But I just thought that that might be the end of it. And I had tried. A few days later, he calls me and he said, I haven't been able to think about anything else. This is a reparations case and I want to meet and go over it with you. And so, lo and behold, let's make a long story short, Ben was very interested in the case, but he wasn't licensed to practice in Connecticut, so he needed a Connecticut attorney. He also had a cameo role with Sabrina Fulton and her husband Tracy in a movie called Marshall, which was written by a Connecticut attorney. So on the Hollywood set, Ben is sitting talking about this case to the man who wrote the screenplay for Marshall, who happens to be Michael Koskoff, who just fell in love with the story and said, anything I can do to help. Again, that goodwill and grace that I'm talking about. And so that's why I call it the making of a dream team. These two powerhouse attorneys come together, and as Mike puts it, wrote a complaint that knocked Harvard back on its heels. And if you We filed a complaint on March 19th or March 20th of 2019, and I like to include this because this is an art piece where they did a whole cartoon sketch about the story and the complaint, and it was done by a young person in Europe, I believe, but this was also on the front page of the New York Times when we filed, and so when the complaint was filed, it kind of went viral. And the next slide, I think, shows our press conference that we had in New York, and you know, there was a lot of media interest. And the next slide. And this is something that, you know, in the book I develop, and I like to talk about the generational trauma caused by slavery. And I also like to show and to say that it's not a black thing, it's not exclusively a black thing. And I say that because of these two women. When my complaint was filed, Marion, who's on the left, she saw the article in the New York Times and she reached out. She is a descendant of the Harvard scientist, the racist scientist who did the horrific scientific experiment on my enslaved ancestors, and she reached out and she says, what can I do to help? And she's in Minnesota, and her sister Susanna is in Berkeley, California. And you know, at this point I'm saying we just have to share the story because Harvard was doing such a phenomenal job at squashing and silencing the story. But what these two women did, we had a press conference, they put together a letter, we delivered it to Harvard, because at this time Harvard was saying, you know, these daguerreotypes belong to the Agassiz, daguerreotypes. The Agassiz family comes forward and says, give Tammy the daguerreotypes. Yes. And of course, Harvard ignores them. But these women, they talk about when they learned about what their ancestor had done. They were mortified, and they knew growing up that he has, as I think Susanna puts it, some complications or some issues with race, but they didn't learn it until the complaint how terrible it was and what he had actually done. And so they were inspired to step up, and they said to step out of their comfort zone and to do whatever they need to do to help. And I say that because, you know, just as I encourage people to do the genealogical work and look into your family trees to see what you might find, sometimes when you look into these trees, you find things that you don't know how to deal with and that you have trouble accepting or embracing. And that's what these young ladies did. But also, you know, and I just opposed them to the Taylors, wonderful people, but, you know, in the conversation, the media had reached out, and many of them didn't want to talk because they didn't want their friends to know what their ancestors did. And so, you know, I share this story, particularly about the Agassiz children and Susanna and Marion, because I think that there's a healthy and then there is an unhealthy way of dealing with the trauma caused by slavery. And you know, I'm not judging, I'm not trying to impose my will on how I think people need to react and learn and deal with that. But I'm saying, you know, for me personally, there's a healthy way and an unhealthy way. And I think what they're doing to step out of their comfort zone and say, what can I do to help? What can I do to bring attention to it? Was a good step in terms of trying to atone for the sins of their ancestor and to deal with it in a way that's healthy.
Sorry, I'm getting caught up in the story.
We filed. Our argument was simple. When Harvard created the daguerreotypes, it was illegal for them to do because the state of Massachusetts had abolished slavery. So Renty and Delia were in effect crime victims whose property, whose dignity, and whose image was taken from them illegally. And we were asking for its return. Harvard's argument was the photo, irrespective of the violence, irrespective of how it was acquired, always belongs to the photographer. And they said it was settled law. And so we just really thought, you know, this is a no-brainer. This is, you know, it's a crime. What they did was wrong. And the judge ruled that Harvard could keep the daguerreotypes and dismissed our case. And so that after that, next slide, we appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And if you haven't had an opportunity, I know there's some of it that's in the book, but that 91-page decision was a stinging indictment of Harvard. They basically, and Harvard has great PR people. because every time we would make gains in court, they would come out with some amazing thing that took the attention away from what we were doing and made it all about how wonderful they were. Like when we had this victory, Harvard came out with a $100 million pledge to study their ties to slavery, which went viral. And so the gains that we were making in court were being suppressed by, and this was, Harvard has great PR flex, and they were doing their jobs, but they were able to always go beyond the story and recreate a narrative that made them to be the hero and me the villain. And so, but the judges' rulings, they called Harvard out on their conduct. They called Harvard out for their mistreatment of me. And they did something historic. And I am very, very, very proud of this fact. I know that there have been reparations cases that historically have been filed. This case is the only case, as we sit here now, that has survived the motion to dismiss and will proceed on to a jury decision. All other cases have been dismissed. The Tulsa case, all of the cases will not have a verdict, will not have a jury decision. And so, I am, that's not lost on me, the historicness of that. But also, in addition to that, we did not ask for reckless infliction of emotional distress. The Supreme Justices said, when you go back and this case proceeds, I want you to add it. Yes. And they said to Harvard, your past conduct cannot be divorced from your present misconduct. So what you did in the past, what Louis Agassiz did in the past with my enslaved ancestors is as equally a part of this case as all of their attempts to deny me, to suppress my story, and they said they cannot be separated, and they are equally a part of the case. And so the court added an emotional distress piece for my enslaved ancestors or for me. So whether we settle or whether there's a verdict, Harvard will be, I believe, the first American institution to pay reparations. And this is just it. And she said, Harvard's conduct thus belies its purported commitment to enable descendants to recover their histories, to tell their stories, or repair meaningfully the harm that it has done to. They just reamed Harvard. This is the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the final arbitrator in the state of Massachusetts. And so, yes. And also the beauty of them, of the justices adding this and their language being so condemning is when we go back, because we did go back and we filed as the courts had asked. And then Harvard immediately files another motion to dismiss after being spanked by the court. And the presiding judge says, I read the decision. And so it's the framework for how we proceed moving forward. And they have basically pigeonholed Harvard into a position, and they can't get around it because their only alternative would have been to take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they didn't. So now they're stuck with this condemning, this indictment of them. And the language, again, if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, the 91-page decision, they not only Harvard and the Board of Overseers, but they talk about the Peabody museums as a whole, as to ethical stewardship and what to curate and how to curate, and also consideration for the impacted people. And like I said, they just spanked Harvard, and it was a beautiful decision. And this is the Harvard students, and what they did was they formed a coalition to free renting. And I just included because they are, I tell them that they are the conscience of the university, and the university has to learn to listen to them because they're right. And so, but they have been an important part of this, not only the case, But they putting the moral pressure on the university to do the right thing. Next.
We're going to turn over the conversation to Lisa now. Usually we say the last 15, 20 minutes for you all, but because you're able to enjoy all of Tamara's, not only her story, but her pictures, thank you so much for sharing. We'll now give it to Lisa for the last bit of the program.
Yeah, my question is not even really a question. It's more, one thing that you didn't touch on in this, because I got quickly obsessed with your story also, and read a lot of stuff that has been written about you in podcasts that you've done. And so you've spoken about how all these things align. But another thing that really aligned for you is place. It's really important that you brought this case in Connecticut. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's important?
Well, you know, one of the things I thought about is, what if I lived in California, you know, like where I wasn't in close proximity where I could go. Like, I did go to the Peabody Museum and I did view the daguerreotypes. I write about that experience. I liken it to, you know, I'm a retired probation officer. I would often visit inmates in correctional facilities, and I felt like, you know, the way I was treated there is like I was going to a correctional facility, visiting an inmate, and being greeted by very curt and militaristic and rude prison guards. But I also, you know, because Connecticut, you know, being so close to Massachusetts, and the attorneys, like Mike Koskoff, who has also since passed away, you know, I don't think I would be as successful if I was represented by anybody else. And you know, it is the work that the attorneys have done for years. We started this in 2016, 2017. My attorneys have been working on this legal case for almost 10 years now. And so I just feel like everything aligned, not only because of the close proximity to me and to have access to Harvard, but the resources. It was just, this was...
And also the fact that slavery had been abolished there, right?
Yes, there's a lot of history, and I talked a little bit about growing up. You know, it was always about history in the South. I mean, slavery in the South. I was a history major in college, and I'm really just learning the history of this country, particularly when I talk about, you know, the Connecticut, the Websters, Noah Webster, Daniel Webster, abolitionists. But what I'm learning is, I refer to it as lackluster convictions, because they weren't really abolitionists. I mean, publicly they would talk, they probably weren't thrilled with slavery. Harvard, many of their overseers were profiting from slavery. My attorney wrote in the complaint, cotton was the thread that held the Union together. Harvard's motivation was always about financial motivation. In the 1850s, when the daguerreotypes were taken, you know, the Fugitive Slave Act had just been passed. This was a campaign to create propaganda to convince the politicians that slavery was the right way to go. And so what Harvard did was they stepped in and they put their thumb on the scale with scientific proof of black inferiority. And so just as today, and equally so in 1850, when you have these very influential academics stepping in, giving their opinion, it kind of creates the narrative. And their opinion was that slavery must proceed because they were all making their fortunes. Were in the Industrial Revolution in the North, and the cotton mills, the Negro Club, they were all responsible for that. So slavery had to persist. And so, but there's, you know, unfortunately, behind every bad motive, there's somebody pursuing money. But it was all financial. And even now, them telling my state, they wanted to publish a book. And they were marketing this book, and they were moving forward with this book. And then I come along with an alternative narrative of the book. I had to go away. But, you know, unfortunately.
Thank you for not going away. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
So we do have some time for your questions. So if you do have a question, I ask you to direct it to this microphone here, or to the microphone across the aisle. Our programs are hybrid, so we have an audience at home watching as well. This way they can hear your question. So please, if you have a question, please make your way to the microphone right now.
Good evening. Don't have a question. I listened to the book today. I loved it.
Thank
Loved the
you.
way you wrote it, and I wanted to thank you for the book. I did write. I said thank you for your tenacity. I wrote it down because I'm forgetting. And giving me the courage and strength to never stop, because you never stopped, and because of that. And the last piece that I took away was always remember, never forget, and write it down. And I will
That was my mother, and you know, one thing that I say, you know, I didn't talk about our relationship, how close we were as mother and daughter. I love my mother more than I can explain, and her passing really rocked me to my core, and I had a lot of difficulty with promising her that I would do something. There were no broken promises between us. I mean, you know, our relationship was so unique, and we had such a love for each other. And so when Harvard denies our legacy and her story, I took it as a personal affront to her, which motivated me even more. So, yes, thank you.
Hi. You come across as so soft and dainty, but you're not going on, and I respect that. And what a great story. What a great, thank you for your tenacity to bring it to us. I have ancestors in Columbia, from Columbia, South Carolina, and we're going to have our reunion there in 2060, in 2025, this year. But I've never heard of the yucca plants, and I've never even seen or heard anyone tell of that. Where is it exactly? Is it located?
Child Cemetery. The Child Cemetery. Yes. And there is an amazing story about a woman who also has passed on. Her name is Sonia. She was Sancho Thompson's descendant, but she was trying to restore the cemetery. And you know, if you haven't had an opportunity, you need to visit African American slave burial grounds and see the disrepair and how our ancestors were literally thrown away and not cared for. Many of these people are Civil War veterans that are buried here who deserve the dignity of a decent final resting place, who don't get that honor. It's a chilling experience to go there and see that.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we want to switch sides? I know something.
No.
Good evening. I'm Shirley Corbin. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut.
Okay.
And while in school, elementary, middle school, high school, we never heard about slaves being in any part of Connecticut. And every time slavery was mentioned, it was always a part of the South. And I just want to thank you so much for writing the book and even coming to Baltimore so I can hear another story and the right story. Thank you.
Thank you. And I concur, that was my experience as well. It wasn't until recently I learned how equal the North was in this ugly institution of American slavery.
Good evening. Like everyone else here, I just wanted to, I couldn't just sit without standing and just saying how thankful we are for you to knock that down and to honor our ancestors. And I wanted to introduce myself and say that when I saw in the compass that you were coming, your name, of course, caught my attention. My name is Tracy Lanier Thompson. So whether related or not, this story was one that just touched me. My daughter and I, when I saw it in the compass, I registered and we went on a deep dive. We watched the documentary, we're waiting anxiously for the book. I cannot wait to read it, and I can't wait to get a picture with you. But thank you so much.
I just want to speak to that, and I refer to it as, you know, when we're doing the genealogical work, it's like an adopted child trying to piece their family back together. But I always, when I see people with the name Lanier or Thompson, the first thing I think of is, are you family? And why we do that is because our families were so violently broken and displaced from family that we could be family, and we don't know. And so that's unique to the Black experience and the descendants of American chattel slavery. I don't know if other people have that experience, but when I see those names, I'm thinking, are you a part of the lost family?
Question coming from our audience watching online, and it does relate to genealogy. What resources would you recommend for others who are researching their family's history?
Wow. I'll say it again. I have been the benefactor of so much goodwill and grace. And when I talk about God's grace, I have to say, and I write about this, that I believe that God put people in my path and information at my fingertips, because there's no other explanation for how things were revealed to me. I sit here as a blessed woman who has, you know, the favor that I talk about, and you know, Rose, I didn't go into that, but I met her on social media, and in talking with Rose, she actually was the person who had the document that proved that put my ancestors on the enslavers' land, because Harvard at the time was saying, you'll never prove that your Renty is our Renty, and you'll never be able to prove it. And so I started this friendship with Rose because I joined this Columbia, South Carolina group on Facebook, and we start talking. And one day I'm telling her, you know, I was troubled by Delia and I gotta find where she's buried. And Rose said, I saw Delia with a George Thompson. I said, that's a relative, I have his death record. And so she said, text it to me, and I did. And she replied, oh my God, and I replied, oh my God, what? And she doesn't say anything and doesn't text me, so I call her, Rose, oh my God, what? She said, George Thompson is buried in Arthurtown. Yes. She said, Arthurtown is land owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor, previously owned by Benjamin Franklin Taylor. I'm like, oh my God, Rose, how do you know this? My family purchased the land and established Arthurtown. I'm like, oh my, and we're talking, this happened in 1876. I'm like, oh my God, Rose, how are we going to prove this? She said, I got the deed. And I get chills every time I talk about this, because of all the millions and millions and millions of people that I could have met on social media. I started a friendship with the one person in the world who would look at that document and know it for what it was, because Rose's family, Rose is the genealogist and the historian in her family, and only she would have known it, and God connected us. And that's the document that shut Harvard up, because I said, now I can put my ancestors living, dying, and buried on the slaveholders' land. That's just grace.
Tammy, you and I have a very dear mutual friend, Liz.
Yes.
And I have a question. When was that brought to your attention what Harvard was doing?
Social media. Every time Harvard would do something, I would get tagged on. So, did you know about this? Did you know about this? Did you know about this book? Did you know about this seminar? So you know, again, I was just privy to so much information. I did not know these things. It was the people on social media who had heard my story, and when they would hear about new things happening, they'd tag me. And they'd say, did you know Harvard's doing this? Did you know Harvard's doing that? And I just want to add one more thing, because I want to introduce Liz and her daughter Bella, and she's my collaborator in the book. And you know, again, I can go on and on and on to talk about the good fortune that I've had, but I had been trying to break through into the publishing industry. I was going to self-publish because I just wanted to tell my mom's story and get a book to give to my mom to say I've kept my promise. And so I was contacted by some journalism students at Harvard who had learned about the case and wanted to interview me for their thesis project. And I said, sure. So we spent a lot of time together. We were working on, we did diaries, we did video, we did everything. And they presented an amazing case to their professor and to their class. Their professor happened to be Jill Abramson, who was the former CEO of the New York Times. And when she learned of this story, she was just so taken back. Of course, these are people who were right there at Harvard, but Harvard has been so good at suppressing it, she didn't even know. And then the question is, how could this be? But later we met, and she said, you have to tell your story. And I said, I've been trying. And she said, I'm going to connect you with my publicist and my agent. And, you know, she connected me with all these people. And one of them was Suzanne Gluck, who said, I'm going to connect you with a collaborator. And then I started to get worried because I'm like, okay, I needed to know that the collaborator could understand what it's like to be a black woman and could understand not only the history of the disenfranchisement of black people, but just all of it, the racial profiling, the social justice piece. And so thinking, okay, I'm gonna have to educate it, and I'm gonna have to do a lot of pre-teaching before we could get to this book. And just, you know, just as I've been saying, how, again, just how things were just being orchestrated for me, when I met Liz, and Suzanne did not know these things about Liz, but she had such a strong social justice presence. She was involved in so much and doing so much work, and she just had been invested in black culture and black. I didn't have to teach her. I didn't have to, so she was able to hit the ground running. We were able to work on this book together, and you know, all my fears were allayed because I'm just worried because it was important to have, for the book to have the right voice. And so when I met her, you know, she has done a phenomenal job, and she's an amazing collaborator.
We have time for one more question. We'll take it from the online audience. What has Harvard's reaction been to the book?
No comment. And honestly, whenever the press would reach out, I mean, early on they would say things like she can never prove it, or she's giving us nothing to show that she's a descendant of Renty, but now they're not commenting.
Please help me thank today's moderator, Lisa McCrae, and our author, Tamara Lanier. So I want to share with you that today is the release date of this book. Today is his birthday. So please celebrate by purchasing a copy of the book and having Tamara sign it. I'm sure she'd be happy to take photos with you. I'm sure she's happy to talk to you a little longer. So we'll be outside in about 5 minutes. Thanks so much.